The knock came at 6:09 in the morning. Not a polite knock. Not the kind a neighbor makes when they need to borrow something. The kind that means the person on the other side has a badge and does not need your permission. Naomi was already awake. She'd been awake since 5, lying in the dark of her New York apartment, doing the math she'd done every morning for 11 straight days. Rent due Friday. Bank account $260 short. 2 unanswered client emails sitting in her inbox like quiet verdicts she wasn't ready to open. The loop ran itself on repeat in the dark, the way anxiety does, efficient and merciless and completely immune to reason. She heard the knock and sat up. She pressed her eye to the peephole. 2 men in dark jackets. Federal badges catching the hallway light. Standing directly in front of apartment 4C. Caruso's door. She knew that door. She'd stood in front of it exactly twice in 10 months, once to return a misdelivered package, once during a building-wide blackout when her candles were dead and his was the only light on the floor running on something else. Both times the door had opened just enough. Both times Caruso had given her what she needed without making her feel like she'd asked for it. That was his way. Precise. Contained. Like a man who had spent a long time deciding exactly how much space to occupy. Now his door opened again. And Caruso stood in the frame the way people stand when they knew something was coming and chose not to run from it. He was calm. That was the detail that stayed with her. Not panicked. Not pleading. He looked at the 2 agents the way someone looks at a storm they tracked for days, not surprised by the arrival, just finally facing it. He turned around slowly. Let them secure his hands. And walked down the hallway between them without once looking back. The elevator doors closed. Naomi stood at the peephole for a long time. Her hand was pressed flat against the wall. She didn't know why she couldn't move. Then her phone rang. It was Gerald Marsh, her landlord, a man who communicated exclusively through voicemails and the specific brand of passive aggression that comes from owning property in Manhattan for 30 years. Naomi almost let it go to voicemail. But something about the timing, something about the cold weight that had settled in her chest since the hallway, made her answer. "Miss Naomi," Gerald said. "I'm calling to let you know your account is current. Rent has been covered through the end of the year." A beat. Has been, actually. Since January. She heard the words. Understood them one at a time. But together they formed a sentence her brain refused to process. "I'm sorry, what?" "Paid in full. Every month. Same account." Another beat, quieter. "I assumed you knew." His voice dropped a register. "Shame about your neighbor." He hung up. Naomi stood in the middle of her kitchen in yesterday's clothes, phone pressed to her sternum, the early morning light cutting thin lines across the floor. She thought about the past 9 months. Every week she'd budgeted down to the dollar. Every month she'd felt that specific, private relief when rent cleared, the relief she'd credited to her own careful math. Her own discipline. Her own survival. Except she hadn't been surviving alone. Someone had been closing the gap every single month. Quietly. Without asking for anything. Without even letting her know the weight she believed she was carrying alone had actually been shared. If you've ever stood in a room and realized something enormous had been happening right beside you, and you were the very last to know, then you already understand what Naomi felt in that kitchen. It wasn't gratitude yet. It wasn't even shock. It was something older and quieter than both. The specific ache of being cared for by someone who never once asked for credit. And underneath all of it, one question that would not leave her alone. Why? But that was only the beginning. Because the more she tried to answer that question, the more she realized she had been looking at Caruso through the wrong lens entirely. Before Naomi could understand what Caruso had done, she needed to understand who he was. And the honest answer, the one she'd never had to put into words until now, was that she wasn't sure. Not completely. Not the way you know people you've actually let in. He'd moved into apartment 4C 14 months ago. She remembered because it was the same week she moved in, both of them new to the building, arriving within days of each other like the opening punctuation of the same unwritten sentence. She saw him in the elevator on her 3rd morning. Tall, dark-haired, late 30s, carrying nothing but a single bag and a cardboard box sealed with enough tape to survive a flood. He nodded at her. She nodded back. The elevator reached the 4th floor and they both stepped off and went in opposite directions. That was their introduction. For the first 2 months, he was simply the neighbor who kept reasonable hours and never played music loud enough to bleed through the wall. In a building where the man in 3A held full-volume arguments 3 times a week and the woman above her ran what appeared to be an indoor track circuit every morning at 7, Caruso's silence felt like a gift she hadn't requested but was grateful to receive every single day. She learned things about him the way you learn things about people you're not deliberately studying. Gradually. In pieces. Like a puzzle you weren't assembling on purpose but keeps appearing at the edges of your vision. He worked from home, but not lazily. His lights were on before 6 in the morning. Still on past midnight. The few times she passed him in the hallway with his laptop bag, he moved like someone who always knew exactly where he was going, that specific, unhurried confidence that doesn't announce itself because it doesn't need to. He wasn't a talker. He didn't fill silence with words the way most people do, to appear friendly, to avoid discomfort. When he spoke, it was because he had something worth saying. Naomi had appreciated that more than she was able to admit at the time. Their first real exchange happened by accident, the way most real things do. It was an October evening, outside the building's mail bank in the lobby. Her freelance check, $220 for a logo project she'd spent 3 days on, had been folded into her box wrong and she'd torn the corner pulling it out. She made a sound she didn't intend. Just a small, involuntary exhale of frustration. Caruso, collecting his own mail 4 slots down, looked over. "Everything okay?" "Fine," she said. The way people say fine when it isn't. He looked at the torn envelope corner. He didn't offer advice. Didn't say it would probably still cash. He just said, "Long week." "Long year," she said, before she could stop herself. He nodded, as though that were a complete and entirely sufficient answer, and went back to his mail. But as he walked toward the elevator he said, without turning around, "Coffee place on Mercer opens at 5:30 if you ever need a head start on the next one." She didn't go the next morning. But she thought about it. And the morning after that, when the anxiety woke her before 5 and her apartment felt like it was pressing in from every wall, she went. The coffee was good. The light through the window was the kind of early gold that makes New York feel forgiving instead of indifferent. She sat alone and felt, for the first time in months, like she might still be standing at the end of all of this. She never told Caruso she'd gone. But something in her suspected he already knew. Their exchanges stayed small after that. A grocery run where they ended up walking the same 2 blocks back and she learned he cooked on Sundays and didn't own a television. An afternoon in the building courtyard where she was sketching logo concepts and he sat on the bench across from her reading without once asking what she was working on, which she realized later was the most respectful thing anyone had done for her creative process in years. Small things. Quiet things. The kind that don't register as significant until you finally add them all up. But Naomi had been careful. She was careful the way people are careful after they've been burned by someone who seemed safe. She kept a wall between neighborly warmth and anything deeper. She answered his questions honestly but didn't ask enough of her own. She laughed with him but kept the real parts of herself behind a door she told herself she'd open later, when she was more healed, more certain, when she wasn't still carrying the wreckage of the year that had taken everything from her. She never opened that door. And now Caruso was in federal custody. And she had no idea who she'd actually been living across the hall from for the past 10 months. What she didn't know yet was that Caruso had known exactly who she was from the very beginning. Naomi spent the morning after the arrest doing the one thing that kept her functional when the ground disappeared beneath her. She worked. She opened her laptop, pulled up a half-finished brand identity for a Connecticut architecture firm, and stared at it until the colors stopped making sense. Then she closed the laptop. Made coffee she didn't drink. Opened the laptop again. Closed it. She couldn't stop thinking about January. January was the month she had almost left New York. She hadn't told anyone that, not her sister Clara in Massachusetts who would have pushed her to come home, not her college friend who would have offered a couch and good intentions wrapped in an undercurrent of pity. She'd told no one because the decision felt too fragile to survive being spoken out loud. Like a flame in an open window. The year before had taken everything in sequence. A branding contract for a boutique hotel in California had collapsed when the owner decided he wanted a different direction, which was professional language for he'd found someone cheaper and had no intention of paying for the work she'd already delivered. The legal dispute took 6 weeks and resolved in a settlement that covered a third of what she was owed. By December her savings were gone. By January the math had stopped working no matter how she ran it. Rent was $1,150 a month for a studio that faced a brick wall but was hers, and she was looking at 2 more months before she'd have to pack and leave the city that had been her home for 5 years. But February's rent cleared. She'd checked the account 3 times, certain she'd miscounted somewhere. Then March cleared. Then April. Every month, on time, the exact right number. She'd felt relieved. She'd credited her own discipline, her careful management, the resolve of someone who refused to be broken by a bad year. She had been so quietly, privately proud of herself for staying afloat. The whole time, Caruso had been across the hall. Paying the difference. Saying nothing. The question eating her alive wasn't just why. It was, how did he know? She pulled on her jacket and went to the one person in the building she trusted to tell her the truth, Ellis, the superintendent, a retired ironworker from the Bronx who had lived in the building for 23 years, knew everyone's history, and dispensed information the way certain people dispense medicine, carefully, in the exact dose he decided you needed, only when he believed you were ready for it. She found him in the basement rewiring a circuit panel. He looked at her over his reading glasses when she came down the stairs and said, before she could open her mouth, about 4C. I'm guessing. She sat on an overturned crate. Tell me what you know. Ellis set his tool down. He was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that means someone is weighing how much truth to pour at once. Caruso's been in this building 3 years, he said. Not 14 months. He was in 2B originally. Moved to 4C 14 months ago because 2B was too far from your unit. The air in the basement shifted. He noticed you, Ellis said plainly. When you first moved in. Not strangely, don't make that face. The way someone notices when a person is carrying more than they should and working very hard to make it look like nothing. He asked me once, quietly, whether the woman in 4D was doing all right. I told him what I knew, which wasn't much. He didn't ask again. He just started paying my rent. 3 months after you moved in. Ellis picked up his tool. He never asked me to tell you. Made it clear he didn't want you to know. Naomi was silent for a long time. The fluorescent light buzzed overhead. She thought about the coffee shop on Mercer. About the October hallway. About every quiet exchange she'd filed under neighborly courtesy and now had to reclassify entirely. Who is he? She finally asked. What does he do? Ellis looked at her for a long moment before answering. The kind of work, he said carefully, that requires trusting people with things they can't verify. And he has the kind of character that attracts people who take advantage of that. He turned back to the panel. The conversation was finished. Naomi carried the weight of that answer all the way back upstairs. Because she understood now, or was beginning to, that whatever had brought those federal agents to Caruso's door was not recklessness. It was not greed. It was the same quality that had made him help a stranger without needing recognition. He trusted people. He gave, quietly and completely, because that was simply who he was. And somewhere, someone had used that against him. What she still didn't know was how far the betrayal went. Or how much it was going to cost him. She found his lawyer by accident. She'd spent 2 days trying to locate where Caruso was being held, hitting walls at every turn. Federal detention records in New York aren't public the way local ones are, and no one at any number she called would confirm anything without a verified relationship to the detainee. She was not a wife. Not a family member. Not listed as an emergency contact. She was a neighbor with a stack of unanswered questions and no legal standing, and the system had no interest in either. Then, on the 3rd morning, someone knocked on her door. Mid-40s. Sharp eyes. Dark suit that had seen the inside of a courtroom more times than most people see a doctor. She carried a leather portfolio flat under one arm and introduced herself without preamble, Soren James. Caruso's attorney. He asked me to come to you specifically, Soren said, once she was seated at Naomi's kitchen table. He said if he was ever arrested, I should find you. He said you'd have questions and you deserved real answers. Naomi sat across from her. Who is he? Soren opened the portfolio. Caruso worked as a private financial analyst. Specifically, he structured asset protection arrangements for individuals whose finances might become legally exposed before they were ready. Primarily whistleblowers. People preparing to go on record against large institutions who needed their personal assets legally insulated before the process began. Naomi waited. For 6 years, every arrangement he built held. No one lost their protection. No one was exposed prematurely. Soren's voice was even and measured. 18 months ago, a man named Harlan Voss approached him. Claimed to be a mid-level executive at a Washington, D.C. financial firm preparing to testify about a years-long fraud scheme. Caruso took the case. Spent 6 months building Voss a complete, airtight protective structure. It was meticulous work. And Voss wasn't a whistleblower. Soren's expression didn't change. Voss was running the fraud. The testimony he claimed he was preparing to give was entirely fabricated. He used Caruso's protective structure to hide $14 million in assets from a federal seizure order that had already been issued. She set both hands flat on the table. Caruso had no idea. Every document Voss provided was forged. The company was real. The fraud was real. Caruso's involvement was genuine, and completely deceived. The refrigerator hummed in the silence. Outside, a taxi leaned on its horn for 3 full seconds and went quiet. "Can you prove that?" Naomi asked. "That's exactly why I'm here." Soren held her gaze steadily. "There's a specific set of digital records, communications from the initial consultation period, that support his account completely. They're in an encrypted archive. Caruso couldn't access them from custody. She let that land. But he told me he'd kept a backup. A physical drive. In his apartment." Her eyes stayed on Naomi's. "He said you had a spare key." The blood moved strangely in Naomi's veins. She did have a key. Caruso had given it to her 4 months ago during a building-wide water shutoff, asking if she could check his plants, 2 small succulents on the windowsill, while maintenance ran through the afternoon. She'd agreed without thinking twice. The key had lived in her kitchen drawer ever since, under a rubber band and a takeout menu she kept meaning to throw away. "He trusted you with the one thing that could save him," Soren said quietly, before he knew he was going to need saving. That sentence went somewhere deep inside Naomi and stayed there. She got the key. Caruso's apartment was quiet. Neat in the way that reflects a disciplined mind, not sparse, not cold, but entirely deliberate. Books organized horizontally by subject. A single photograph on the desk, too far away to read clearly. A small cactus on the windowsill, alive and precise. She stood in the center of the room and felt the strange intimacy of being somewhere private without the person present. Like reading someone's handwriting for the first time. The drive was exactly where Soren had said. Taped to the underside of the second desk drawer. Small. Black. Labeled in Caruso's handwriting, one word, written without drama. Evidence. She picked it up. She thought about January. About every month she'd stayed in New York because somehow, impossibly, the numbers had worked. About a man who'd moved floors to be closer to someone he barely knew, because he'd seen her struggling and decided, without announcement or expectation, to do something about it. About how he had never asked for anything in return. Not acknowledgement. Not gratitude. Not even awareness. She thought about how she had never once asked him why. She walked back across the hall and handed the drive to Soren. Then she asked the question she realized she should have asked 8 months ago. "Can I see him?" The federal detention facility in Lower Manhattan was not designed to make anyone feel welcome. The waiting area was fluorescent lit and plastic-chaired, institutional beige that communicated very clearly that the building's purpose was processing, not comfort. Naomi sat in it for 40 minutes before a guard called her name. In those 40 minutes she rehearsed 11 different versions of what she planned to say and abandoned every single one. There was no script for this. She told herself on the drive over that this was practical. She needed to tell him about the drive, about Soren, about what was happening on his behalf. She was there as a neighbor doing a reasonable thing. The feeling in her chest, that specific, pressurized ache that had been sitting there since the morning of the arrest, was concern. Ordinary human concern. Nothing more complicated than that. She was an excellent liar when the person she was lying to was herself. They brought him in. He looked tired. Not broken. Caruso didn't look like a man who broke easily, but carrying the specific tiredness of someone who had been holding something heavy for a long time and had recently been told it had gotten heavier. He sat down across the glass partition. Looked at her. The first thing he said was, "You shouldn't have come. You sent your lawyer to my door," she said. "For the drive." "Not for," he stopped. Looked at the table. "I didn't think you'd come yourself." "Why not?" He didn't answer. "Caruso." She leaned forward slightly. "Soren told me everything. About Voss. About the work you were doing. About what you built and how it was used against you." She held his gaze through the glass. "And Ellis told me the rest." Something shifted in Caruso's face. Not surprise, exactly. More like the specific expression of someone whose carefully held secret has finally been found, and the exposure and the relief arrive at the exact same moment, and he isn't sure yet which one is louder. "You moved floors," she said. "Naomi. You paid my rent for 9 months without saying a single word to me." He didn't answer. She watched him not answer with the stillness of a man who had rehearsed the argument for staying silent, and was now discovering it didn't hold the way he thought it would. "Do you know what the hardest part is?" Her voice was steady. She was grateful for that. "The hardest part is that it worked. I thought I was holding everything together on my own. I was so proud of making the numbers work. And the whole time," she stopped. Pressed her lips together. "Why?" He was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and careful, like something he'd been carrying for a while and was now setting down. "Because you reminded me of something I'd nearly forgotten." "What?" "That some people are worth protecting even when they don't know they need it." He looked at her steadily. "I watched you for 6 months before I did anything. You worked long days on contracts that underpaid you. You took the difficult projects no one else wanted. You never complained to anyone, never asked for help, never let a single person see the math you were running every morning behind closed doors." He exhaled slowly. "I kept thinking, someone should close that gap. Someone should make the number work so she doesn't have to leave. So I did." Naomi didn't say anything for a moment. "And you never thought to just," she gestured between them through the glass, "talk to me?" The corner of his mouth moved. Not a full smile. Something more honest than that. "You had walls so high I would have needed a ladder to see over them. I was giving you time." "Time for what?" "To trust someone again." His eyes stayed on hers. "You'd been burned. I could see it in the way you moved through the building, like every interaction was a transaction waiting to go wrong. I didn't want to be another person who made you feel like help comes with a cost." The light buzzed overhead. Somewhere behind her, a door opened and closed. Naomi thought about every wall she'd constructed in the past year and a half. Every careful, contained exchange. Every moment she'd retreated behind fine when she was nowhere near fine. She thought about the drive taped under his desk. Kept there without telling her. Left in her hands before he knew he'd need it. Trust placed before the emergency arrived. "I'm not going to let them take you down for something you didn't do," she said. He looked at her. "Soren says the records are clean. The timeline is clear. You were deceived by someone who built a very elaborate lie to use you specifically, because you were careful, and credible, and good at your work." She held his gaze. "You spent 9 months making sure I didn't have to leave New York. I think I can manage a few weeks making sure you get to come back to it." Something changed in Caruso's face then. Not relief, something quieter and more fragile than relief. The look of a man who had been capable and self-contained for so long that he had genuinely forgotten what it felt like to have someone standing on his side of a room. He blinked once. Looked at the table. When he looked back up, his eyes were different. "You're not what I expected," he said. "Neither are you," she said back. And she meant it in every possible direction. She didn't say the rest of what she was feeling. Not yet. There was still a glass wall between them, literally and in every other sense that mattered. But as she stood to leave, she pressed her palm flat against the partition for just a moment. A gesture so small the guard barely registered it. Caruso raised his hand and matched it on the other side. That was enough. For now, that was everything. Hashtag Chapter 6, What Stays After the Storm. The case took 6 weeks to resolve. To anyone watching from the outside, it looked like a legal procedure, documents submitted, depositions recorded, a federal prosecutor reviewing a timeline that grew progressively impossible to argue against. Harlan Voss, it turned out, had done this before. 2 prior financial advisors had been deceived and charged using the same method. The pattern was documented. The records from Caruso's drive, encrypted communications that showed every document Voss had provided was forged from the beginning, were exactly what Soren needed to dismantle the case piece by piece. All charges against Caruso were dropped on a Thursday morning in March. The New York sky was pale gray the way it gets in early spring, undecided between clearing and rain, hovering in that honest in-between that feels more real than full sun. Naomi found out from Soren at 9:47 in the morning. She was at her desk, working on the Connecticut architecture firm project, a significant contract, the kind that had been rare for 2 years and now represented something she hadn't felt in a long time, momentum. She'd accepted it the week before. She'd also quietly told Gerald Marsh, with no explanation offered and none requested, that going forward she would be covering her own rent. She was mid-sketch when Soren's message came through. He's out. He'll call you. She sat back. Put her hands in her lap. Let the breath move through her slowly. He called 11 minutes later. Hey, he said. Just that. Like it was an ordinary Tuesday. Like they spoke every day and nothing between them had changed. Hey, she said back. A silence that wasn't uncomfortable. The kind that has weight and warmth and doesn't need anything added to it. I owe you, he said. You paid my rent for 9 months. That was different. How? Another silence. She could hear street noise behind him, which meant he was outside. Standing on some Manhattan corner in the pale March light, having just walked out of the building that had held him for 6 weeks, and the first call he made was to her. She sat with that fact for a moment. Let it land. What you did was a choice, he said. You didn't owe me anything. You had every reason to take the information about the drive and walk away. Instead you went looking for answers, you trusted Soren when you had no reason to, you showed up when he stopped. Most people wouldn't have. You moved floors for a stranger, she said. I think we're matched. She heard him exhale. Not a laugh, but close. Something loosened between them, a tension she hadn't fully realized was still there until the moment it released. Can I take you to breakfast? He said. The place on Mercer. Properly this time. Where I don't have to pretend I'm not glad you showed up. She was already reaching for her jacket. I'll meet you outside. She took the stairs instead of the elevator because she didn't want to wait. She pushed through the building's front door into the gray Manhattan morning and he was already there, standing on the sidewalk in a dark coat, hands in his pockets, and when he saw her he didn't smile right away. He looked at her first. The way people look at something they've been thinking about for a long time and are finally seeing clearly in the right light. Then he smiled. And it changed his whole face. She walked toward him. He didn't move to meet her. He waited, the way he always waited, with that particular patience that was never passive but always deliberate. When she reached him, he said, You look the same. 6 weeks, she said. I know. His eyes didn't leave hers. Felt longer. They walked to Mercer together, close enough that their arms brushed at every other step and neither of them moved away. The city moved around them the way New York moves, indifferent and magnificent and entirely uninvested in the small human story unfolding on its sidewalk. She told him about the Connecticut contract. He told her, carefully and without bitterness, about the investigation's final days, how Voss had attempted to redirect blame a second time and failed, how the digital records had been definitive, how Soren had been extraordinary. He processed it the way he processed everything, cleanly, factually, already looking forward. She noticed that. Filed it somewhere important. They sat at a corner table by the window. The coffee was exactly what she remembered, warm, not acidic, better than the place on Archer. She wrapped both hands around the cup and looked at him across the small table and understood, with a clarity that arrived gently rather than crashing, that the wall she'd been maintaining for a year and a half was simply gone. She hadn't taken it down deliberately. It had dissolved. Gradually, quietly, over 10 months of small and honest moments with a man who had never once asked her to let him in, who had simply kept showing up with such steady consistency that the wall had stopped having anything to guard against. "I need to ask you something," she said. He waited. "The photograph on your desk. When I went in for the drive, I couldn't see it clearly. Who is it?" He was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that means you are reaching for something true and making sure you have a proper hold on it before you hand it over. "My mother," he said. "She passed 4 years ago. She was a lot like you, actually. Carried everything alone. Refused help. Worked herself to the edge and called it strength." He looked at his cup for a moment. "I watched her do that for 30 years. I decided a long time ago that if I ever saw someone doing the same thing, I'd do something about it. Even if they didn't know. Even if they never thanked me." Naomi didn't say anything for a long moment. The morning light shifted. Outside, the pale gray was finally making its decision, slowly, imperceptibly, beginning to clear. "She sounds like someone worth honoring," Naomi said quietly. She was. He looked up. His eyes found hers and stayed. "So are you." Years later, when people asked how they started, Naomi and Caruso always told the truth. Because the truth was better than anything they could have invented. That she'd heard the knock at 6:09 in the morning. That she'd stood at a peephole and watched the man across the hall walk away in handcuffs and felt something she couldn't name. That she'd found out the same morning that he had been quietly, anonymously keeping her in New York for 9 months without expecting a single thing in return. That she'd gone looking for answers and found something she wasn't looking for at all. They would say it started with a secret. With an arrest. With a drive taped under a desk drawer and a spare key kept in a kitchen drawer under a rubber band. But really, if you pressed them, it started the way the best things always start. Not with a perfect moment or a grand declaration. With a man who noticed a woman carrying too much, and decided, without fanfare or announcement, to carry some of it for her. And a woman who, when she finally found out, didn't run from the weight of it. She walked toward it. Toward him. Into the pale March light of a New York morning. And stayed. If this story of quiet love found in the most unexpected of places moved something in you, if you've ever been carried without knowing it, or carried someone without asking for credit, then you already understand. The most extraordinary love stories don't always begin with fireworks. Sometimes they begin with a knock at the wrong hour, a number that somehow keeps working, and the slow, irreversible realization that you were never as alone as you thought you were.